Well, thank you, Duran, and friends. Yes, that's me in those photographs. And since the title of my talk is 40 years after, you know that you can just add 40 and 40 and you get some idea of the fact that you've got an historical artifact before you. I think what I can do for you today is to talk about that inquiry that we had that began 40 years ago in 1974 and concluded in 1977. And the inquiry was all about a proposed gas pipeline from the Arctic Ocean along the Mackenzie Valley to Alberta. And it was, at the time, the largest project of its kind ever contemplated in Canada. And I know here in Alberta we are at the center of the oil and gas industry and of pipelines. And we're all aware of the current pipeline proposals, the Northern Gateway pipeline to carry bitumen to the west coast of British Columbia and then to China, the Keystone XL pipeline to go from Alberta to Texas, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which will carry oil, twinning a pipeline existing already between Alberta and Burnaby, British Columbia. And so I don't apologize for telling you about this inquiry we did 40 years ago into another pipeline project, a gas pipeline project. And I was a judge at the time, and the federal government appointed me, and my mandate was to consider the social, economic, and environmental impact of the proposed Mackenzie Valley gas pipeline. And to give you some idea of its scope and scale, because it wasn't like normally building a pipeline within a built-up area or even a place that has its variegated landscape like Alberta. It was in the far north, in the Arctic and subarctic regions of Canada, in the Mackenzie Valley and the Western Arctic. And in my report, I described the Arctic gas pipeline project. A gas pipeline will entail much more than a right-of-way. It will be a major construction project across our northern territories, across a land that is cold and dark in winter, a land largely inaccessible by rail or road, where it will be necessary to construct wharves, warehouses, storage sites, airstrips, a huge infrastructure just to build the pipeline. And that's the distinctive thing about building pipelines in wilderness area. You have to build all the industrial infrastructure before you can even start. There will have to be a network of hundreds of miles of roads built over the snow and ice. The capacity of the fleet of tugs and barges on the Mackenzie River will have to be doubled. There will be 6,000 construction workers required north of the 60th parallel to build the pipeline, and 1,200 more to build the gas plants and gathering systems in the Mackenzie Delta. There will be 130 gravel mining operations. There will be 600 river and stream crossings. There will be innumerable aircraft, tractors, earth movers, trucks, and trailers. And the government of Canada decided that my job was not just to consider the gas pipeline in isolation, so to speak, but to proceed on the basis that it would be a pipeline corridor for an oil pipeline to follow. That pipeline, we don't have a map of North America here, but it was a pipeline that was to start in Prudhoe Bay on the north coast of Alaska, because the oil field at Prudhoe Bay in Alaska is not only the largest oil field in the United States, it's the largest gas field. So the gas from Prudhoe Bay was to be transported across the Arctic coast of Alaska, and then across the Arctic coast of the Yukon Territory, and then to the Mackenzie Delta, and there Canadian gas would be picked up, and the pipeline would carry the American gas and the Canadian gas south for 900 miles to the Alberta border, when it would enter the Alberta pipeline system. Now, the proponents had worked very hard in getting ready to prepare their evidence in support of this project. It had to be considered by the National Energy Board, but my mandate was to consider, as I say, its social, economic, and environmental impact, something that in those days the National Energy Board was not doing. Now, let me tell you that I was appointed in 1974. Now, that's 40 years ago, and it is a lifetime ago, because we had never had an inquiry like the Mackenzie Valley inquiry before. And I'll tell you why. When I started out, I had never been to Canada's Arctic. I'd never been to the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, or to Alaska. And of course, this was an international pipeline to come from Alaska into Canada and then south along the Mackenzie Valley. And the oil and gas industry and the pipeline companies had spent about $50 million preparing the evidence in support. So when I was appointed, I had this stack of reports by experts that told me why the pipeline should be built. And in those days, that was the belief we had. Yes, if you're going to build a pipeline to the north to bring gas to the south, to travel to metropolitan centers of the US and Canada, bringing gas, I should correct myself there swiftly, bringing gas to heat our homes and offices and power our industries. That's a good thing. That's what we define as progress. And but I felt that since there were First Nations people affected, the majority of residents in the Mackenzie Valley, the majority of the people who lived there, were First Nations, Dene, and of course the Inuit of the Western Arctic, the Inuvialuit. And then there were the Dene of the Yukon as well. And they had 35 villages, and I thought I should find out what those people thought about the way this inquiry should be conducted. I didn't want to spend my whole life in a big hearing room with all of these experts and not actually hearing from the people whose lives would be affected by the pipeline. And I wanted an opportunity to hear from people who were concerned about environmental issues. And so I went and held preliminary hearings in Yellowknife and Yuvik and Whitehorse, and I said to people, look, I've been appointed to do this. We've never done anything like this in Canada before. How do you think I should go about it? And they came up with some ideas. They said, well, you're going to hold hearings. shouldn't it be a level playing field? Shouldn't there be some funding so that we, the First Nations, can hire lawyers and experts so that we will be able to participate on an equal footing? And the environmental groups said the same thing. There were about 10 of them wanted to participate, and we had never done anything like this before, but I said to Ian Waddell, one of the people on my staff, I said, after hearing from them all, I said, you get those environmental groups together tonight, all 10 of them, and tell them if they form one umbrella group, united environmental group, by tomorrow morning, and come and tell me who they are and what they're going to do, I'll do my best to get some funding for them. And it also became apparent that the municipalities of the Northwest Territories should be funded, as well as some funding for the Northwest Territories mental health people. So the other thing that people said to me was, well, you know, Judge, it's not enough that you sit here in Yellowknife in a big hotel ballroom, not quite as big as this, but you know the kind of room, and where you listen to the experts. You have to find out more about the country, and you have to visit our villages. And I said, yes, that's a good idea. I will. We'll have hearings in the villages. All the villages of the Northwest Territories, the Western Arctic and the Mackenzie Valley, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And so that and there was a third thing they wanted, that was time. They said we should have a year to get ready. And I thought that's a good idea too. So I recommended to the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development at the time, John Chrétien, you will have heard of him, he later became Prime Minister, and I flew to Ottawa and I said, Mr. Chrétien, if this is to be done fairly, we need to fund these groups, and they have to have time, and the inquiry will not be able to start as soon as we had hoped. And he went to Treasury Board and he got funding for these interveners. Now that was a first in Canada. The idea that the Commission should consider the views of people who lived in the path of progress, as well as the people who were promoting progress. And I didn't invent these innovations. They became something that was obvious once you had looked into the matter. Now, there was another thing we did. I wrote to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which was the only broadcaster in the North in those days. And I said, you know, I'm going to be holding this inquiry. I intend to visit all these villages. There are going to be hundreds of witnesses. But it turns out that we have to deal with 6 or 7 languages. There is English, which I speak, and then there are 4 Dena languages, all of them distinct, which people in this vast area, not heavily populated, but still distinct First Nations with distinct languages where they live. And then there's Inuktitut, the language of the Inuvialuit of the Western Arctic. So I wrote and I said, why don't you establish a program to broadcast the evidence given at the hearings to all the villages in the Mackenzie Valley and the Western Arctic so that people will know what's happening and in their own languages. Well, it's one of those letters you send off into the void and you think, well, I've done the best I can. But they did it. And they set up the first Northern Native broadcasting crew, broadcasting in all the Aboriginal languages, and they provided that for an hour every night on CBC radio in prime time, there would be a 10-minute broadcast in each language by the broadcaster who spoke that language. And the broadcasters traveled with me. And there would be 10 minutes in English, and 10 minutes in each of the Aboriginal languages. I don't know how that adds up, but maybe it doesn't come to an hour, but my recollection may be dimming. And on TV, they said there will be 5 minutes on TV every night in prime time following the national news, and it will be alternating English and then one of the Aboriginal languages for each day of the week until we get back to English. And that really was a milestone in establishing Aboriginal broadcasting in the North. Now, the hearings, it took about 1.5 years, and I visited the 35 communities, and in each one of them, I said, okay, I'm here. People knew I was coming, and I said, I want to hear from you. And I said, I'll stay here until everybody's been heard. There may be 200 people living in the village, maybe 300, maybe 400. If you take into account that perhaps only half are adults, it meant sitting through the night, and sometimes in the summer we'd sit through the night into 1 or 2 in the morning because, in that part of the world the sun didn't go down anyway. And heard from them all. Over the period of the hearings, we heard from about 1,000 witnesses in the villages, Aboriginal mainly, but non-Aboriginal as well. And at the hearings in Yellowknife, where the Dene and the UWS were represented, they had lawyers, they had their own experts there. There was cross-examination of the industry's experts because we had engineers, we had geologists, we had economists, we had sociologists, we had experts of every category who testified, including an anesthetist. And that's not somebody who puts you to sleep when you go into the hospital. It's somebody who's an expert in aesthetics. Now, the Mackenzie Valley is largely covered by the boreal forest, and the anesthetist's evidence was, and it was interesting, and I happen to remember him because he was the only anesthetist who testified. He said, well, if we build a pipeline through the forest, it means a cut through the forest, but that break in the forest cover will bring welcome relief to the eye of the traveler by air. Now, this is what's known as covering all the bases. I should tell you that the evidence given by the experts for the industry was absolutely first class. It really was. These were scientists and engineers and sociologists who did their best work. They were cross-examined by counsel for the Dene and the UWS and the environmental organizations, and sometimes by the municipalities or the mental health folks. But I learned a lot. In fact, if some of you are still in school, you might allow me, 40 years after the event, to tell you how I proceeded. I was often in a little village, and I might be sleeping outside or more often having co-opted the nursing station or some other place where there was a soft bed. But every night, before I slept, I sat down and I decided I should write on one piece of paper, one side of a piece of foolscap, what did I learn today that I didn't know yesterday? and you fill up a sheet of paper, and you keep doing that every day, and your work carries on for a year and a half, and pretty soon you've got 300 or 400 or 500 pieces of paper. And I'm not saying you just leave them until it's all over and then look at them, but you work on them constantly. And together with all the reports, the work of your own staff, I had an excellent staff, it means that you've got a picture emerging in your mind of the way you look at this. Now, the people in the villages, the Dene and the Inuvialuit, were largely opposed to the pipeline. They were concerned about the future of the renewable resource economy on which they depend, that is hunting, fishing, and trapping, and the fish and wildlife resources on which it depends. They were concerned about settling their land claims before they agreed to any major project in the Mackenzie Valley, because their land claims had never been settled. They were concerned as well about the eventual influx of thousands of workers, machinery, the landscape changing with this vast project, and they expressed their concerns everywhere I went. And if you read my report, I think it's still studied in the schools, you will see that when I wrote my report, I quoted many of the things they said. They were quite moving and quite eloquent, sometimes in English, often in translation. I visited their fishing sites and hunting camps. I also visited the man-made islands where the industry had established its drilling. I invited representatives of industry to come with me to the villages. I wanted to make sure that we heard from all sides. Now, when I wrote my report, I felt that it had to be written intelligently, but in a style that any person who is willing to read it could understand. I had promised everybody who testified, I will send you a copy of my report, and we did. I illustrated it with photographs of the area. It dealt with the expert testimony, it dealt with the testimony from the villages, it dealt with the major issues that we had to face that I'll come to in a minute. And it was printed in English and in French. And when I sat down to write it, the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs said to me, well, it has to be tabled in the House of Commons, and it can't be tabled in the House of Commons until it has been translated into French. That's going to take more months. What can we do about that? And I said, well, I'm going to be sitting down and writing it over the next 3 months, this office here in Ottawa. Why don't you have the French editor and his team sit down with me? And they can work alongside me, and we did that. And when I was writing my report, I'd hand over what I completed each day to the French language editor, and often he would come back to me the next day. He said, look, point something out. I said, I don't understand this. And I would look at it and said, that's right, I don't understand it either. I'll have to rewrite it. And some of you who, you all know that we have 2 official languages, and documents of national importance have to be written in both languages. When I finished, I put down my pen, and in the office next door, the French language editor put down his pen about 2 or 3 hours later, and it went off to be printed. And he said to me, he said, we usually get a Royal Commission report to be translated. We get 500 pages. And then they say, now, would you translate this for us? He said, this has been a joy for us because we could participate in the actual writing of the document. And when the report was published, I forgive me for mentioning this, it was on the Maclean's bestseller list for 2 or 3 months. It is still the largest selling document ever published by the government of Canada, and the French language version was acclaimed by Le Devoir, the leading newspaper in Montreal, as La Poésie Véritable. Well, now let me tell you about the main issues very briefly. The first recommendation I made was that there should never be a pipeline built across the north coast of Alaska from Prudhoe Bay and across the northern Yukon to the Mackenzie Delta, because that is the calving ground of the porcupine caribou herd, one of the last great herds of caribou in North America, 130,000, 140,000 animals. And the problem with it is that they go to the Arctic coast every summer about June 1st to drop their calves and to forage on the cotton grass that is then coming up on the edge between the water and the land. And they remain there for 2 or 3 months, and then in September they head back up into the mountains of the Yukon, and that's when you can see that great massing of caribou with thousands and thousands of animals heading back up into the mountains. It's one of the greatest sights on Earth, comparable only, I think, to the migration of the Serengeti in East Africa. Well, all of our experience has shown, this is what I wrote in the report, this is what he wrote in the report, and he knew what he was doing. I said, all of our experience has shown in Alaska, where they have a little more experience than we had at that stage, as well as in Canada, that if you occupy the calving grounds of a caribou herd, it will dwindle to just a remnant of a few hundred animals. Because, of course, the caribou occupy a vast range. They travel hundreds and hundreds of miles. But there is only one place on Earth, one place within their range where they can drop their calves and nurse them for 2 months so that they will be healthy enough to accompany them back up into the mountains. So I said, I've heard all the evidence, and I think we should never build the pipeline along that route. I said there are as well 500,000 snow geese. There are 1/3 of the world's whispering swans. There was a whole panoply of reasons for making sure that area remained wilderness forever, because there are some places that should remain in their natural state for future generations. We are stewards of these areas, we're not required to use them all up. Then we had I recommended a whale sanctuary in Mackenzie Bay because the Beaufort Sea has a population of about 5,000 white whales, belugas, and they go to Mackenzie Bay every spring when the water is warm to have their young. And it's the only place where it can be done. I recommended a whale sanctuary. And then in the Mackenzie Valley, I said, I think there is an acceptable route for a gas pipeline from the Mackenzie Delta south along the Mackenzie River for 900 miles to Alberta, a route that is that is environmentally one that presents no lasting dangers. But I said that should not be built. That pipeline should not be built until you have settled the land claims of the people, land claims of the Aboriginal people in the Mackenzie Valley. And those recommendations went to the federal government back in 1977, and they were accepted. And that, it is thought, and after 40 years I'm inclined very much to think, represented an important landmark in the way we decide how we are going to conserve the resources of rural, frontier, and wilderness areas. By the resources, I mean the industrial resources, the oil and gas and the minerals, how we are going to make sure that we make adjustments fairly between the uses we wish to have of those resources and the rights of First Nations and and of course the concerns we have about the environment. And I ask you to look at my report sometime, if you can find a copy, to see how those adjustments were made. And the aftermath has been, of course, oh, by the way, I went down to Washington, D.C. and testified before committees of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives to argue in support of my report, because, of course, in an un-Canadian-like way, I had said to the United States, this calving area for the Porcupine River herd extends well into the United States. You should be our partners in protecting it. And they have been. They established the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in that area, and those calving grounds have been protected ever since. Canada has established 2 wilderness parks in the northern Yukon to protect the resources, the caribou, calving grounds, and the other resources I mentioned. Land claim settlements have been negotiated in the Mackenzie Valley, and I hope I'm not overstepping the mark when I say largely settled. And the fish and wildlife resources upon which Aboriginal people depend have been protected. They have been, they've been now the owners of land and resources, surface and subsurface resources. They are, if you'll recall, I said you can build a pipeline from the Mackenzie Delta to Alberta, 900 miles. This is the route you should follow. Here's the conditions you should observe. And I proposed certain protected wildlife areas along the way. And that route has been approved by the federal government. And the Imperial Oil wants to build a pipeline along that route today, 40 years later. The Aboriginal people would be 1/3 owners of the pipeline if it were to go ahead. It hasn't gone ahead. because so much gas is being found today in the United States, in British Columbia, in Alberta, and in Canada, in conventional gas fields where it is much more, I believe, much more economical to extract it. So I only want to make it clear to you that everybody seems to think I said no to the pipeline. I said no to the pipeline along the route they had proposed, but I said if you limit the route to one that brings out the Canadian gas, it can be done. But first of all, you have to settle the land claims of the Aboriginal people who live there. I should just conclude by saying that there was great interest in my inquiry at the time, and it was because we not only had these Aboriginal broadcasters, but we had the CBC, of course, was broadcasting in English from the inquiry all over the country, and we had many newspaper people who came up and for a longer time or a shorter time would travel with us. And people were very interested for a number of reasons. Canadians are always interested in the Arctic and subarctic regions of Canada. They were interested because at this inquiry, for the first time, Aboriginal people had a role, and they spoke out, and they spoke well, and they indicated how they felt about this, and all of Canada paid attention. We were in the midst of an energy crisis at the time, which of course made the matter more urgent, and the environmental movement had already risen in our midst and was participating in public discussion and had an opportunity in this inquiry to participate fully. Now, I'm afraid that that's a story and a miniature of the work we did so many years ago. I should tell you that close to the end of my work, when I was still traveling, the Prime Minister of Canada invited me to lunch. Pierre Trudeau was his name, and he had traveled down the Mackenzie Valley as a young man, down the Mackenzie River, and he wanted me to tell him all about my travels. So I told him about visiting the hunting camps and the fishing camps, and visiting the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd, and seeing the offshore drilling sites of the oil companies. And he said, "You've got a good job." And I said, "Best job in the country, Prime Minister." And I still think back on it that way, even though I've been steadily employed ever since. So thanks very much. Nice to see you.